Hello and welcome back, guys. You are gaming with me, Brothgar, and today I've got some Forza Horizon 3 action for you. Now, if you followed some of my vlogs in the past, you'll also know that I like to take photographs. It's one of my other hobbies besides playing video games and making YouTube videos, is taking photographs. So here in Forza Horizon 3, they actually have a really sweet, fairly robust photography tool or photo tool right here, and that's what you're seeing. This is actually a live rendering that's going on here inside of the game. So if I turn off some of the, or turn on the overlay, I get to see this different sort of mechanics, and I'm gonna go through the shutter speed and all of these tools to kind of guide you through taking some better photos and just kind of getting you introduced to these photography tools so you can, make some cool desktops or whatever. So let's reset here to default, and this is what it normally looks like if you're just working in the game. And a couple of the other things is I'm no longer rotated. So we'll just bring that right back to 0 or pretty close to it. And zoom is normally 1x right here. So real quick here, let's take a look at the scene because that is probably equally important as knowing the controls. So the scene here is taking place just at dusk. So the sun is just going down. This is known as the golden hour. There's two of them, one in the morning when the sun's coming up and the other when it's going down. And inside of Forza Horizon 3 here, it has an amazing skybox. So I have some clouds because it's been raining. The sun's going down, so I have some nice oranges, some gold, some blues, and it's really just making a very nice color palette that then washes over everything right here. So not only that, I'm also driving a really sexy car here, the Ford GT, probably my favorite car of all time currently because it's just so beautiful. Anyhow, I love this car. The first and foremost thing, if you take and you look wherever you're looking, wherever you're pointing, you press X, that's going to set your focus distance to focus on whatever it is you're looking at. Pretty important once we get into some of these other controls. You also notice that everything is blurring out, and that is speed. So if we go and press Y here, we're going to go into the effects here. That is because of shutter speed. Now, a real life example of shutter speed is probably this image right here. So this image has a very, very slow shutter speed of like 40 seconds where I'm doing light painting. So I'm actually moving lights around in the background of the subject right here, and that's what then exposes that light over a long amount of time to create the image itself. So that's one of the hobby things that I like to do right there, which is light painting. So going back into the game, shutter speed is how long that shutter is open. So anything that is in focus, that is dead, basically your car is going to be fixed. So it will be sharp, but the background is trying to blur out there, and you see the different samples as you're moving around here. Now, one of the things to notice is that just looking at the sort of default setting of 100, those samples really do blur out quite a bit, but it doesn't necessarily look all that realistic. So maybe an example here in real life of what motion blur looks like is a picture of this car right here. I was just driving around as a passenger, and I took a picture of this car so you can see where it's in focus right here, and then everything else is blurring around quite a bit. So that's an example of motion blur in real life, and you can also look at any magazine to kind of get that idea. Now, playing around with this, obviously slowing down your shutter speed is going to more or less make everything static. So this is a very, very fast shutter speed, which you'd normally use on your camera, and that makes everything sharp. So that's a simulation of that. Turning this up, I like to keep this, usually I like to keep it pretty low, pretty much 15 or lower, unless I'm going for a really dramatic shot. Just because when we kind of get into the water effects right here, which adds a little bit of stuff to it, it doesn't make it disappear, but at the same time, it also doesn't wash it out completely. So maybe leaving this right around 7, you get the idea that it's right there, and we also get the idea that there's grain in the road, but without completely washing it out. Because if you crank this up, well, it's just gonna blur out completely. So, maybe 8 or 7 right there. And again, if you wanna change how that works, you can change the speed of your car because that's going to affect how those samples work. So if you're driving really fast, obviously you don't need as much blur right there. So that changes some stuff right there. The next thing here is obviously your focus, which is going to be your focus distance. Again, you're normally setting that with X, but you can change it normally if you want to, by sliding that around. Exposure is going to change how bright or how exposed your picture is, not necessarily how bright it is, but it's going to change just how exposed your image is. So there you go, you can really bring in and make this look more like daytime by exposing it. Anything that's super bright You're not really going to get back in post editing, so you don't want to overexpose your film or your image, because if you're going to do some post processing, you want to keep that. Since it is pretty much dark and we're just about losing the light here, this is pretty good exposure, being right up here at 100 or 90 or so, because you can play around with that. Again, if it's pure black or full white, you're going to lose it. Aperture style, that is more or less how much blur is going to be in the background. So if we crank this up, just to give you an example, you can just play with this stuff and get an idea right there. But that is also known as, well, aperture in a camera right there. So you have your focal length, and it's how big the diameter is, which then affects the background, which the artistic name for that is bokeh. You'll see that term thrown around quite a bit. Again, right here, this is some pretty nasty bokeh, which is known as the quality of the background blur. So I like to leave this down quite a bit. So if I leave this more like 20 or lower, it starts to look more realistic. And just to give you a real life example, I have another photograph I took of a classic car that I was driving around. So this is an actual photo I took of this guy right here, and you can see the background is blurred, so it has some nice bokeh, but it isn't like, it's not all sampley, it's just blurry. So that's what I don't want to happen right there. I want it to look blurry, but I don't want it to look oversampled. And that's one of the things you see in this game, because it kind of likes to shutter it around. So what we can see is if we change the focus of how this works, and especially if you crank up the aperture, you'll see how it takes several images and then kind of puts them on top of each other, and that just starts to look kind of nasty. So I like to leave this down quite a bit. Again, set that focus up nice and close right there. Contrast is going to change your contrast between your highs and lows. So you really crank this, you can then, your brights are really bright and your lows are really low. Again, depending on how much post-processing you want, you may want this to be under contrast, you may want this to be over contrast. You don't really want to lose stuff in shadows, and you don't really want to lose stuff in brights. Again, you can play with this. For the video, it looks pretty good right around here, and I also think the exposure might as well just be 100, because I think it looks a little bit darker in the video when I'm recording it. Color, again, is how much saturation. So depending on what you're going for style-wise, you may crank this up for a more dramatic shot, which we'll get into here in a little bit once we start playing with the focal length, which is in the effects tool right here. Brightness, again, just affects the more or less, I think, where the gamma center is, changing just how bright it is. Same sort of idea there. Don't want to lose things in darkness and don't want to lose them in brightness. I kind of like to leave that right at 50. You could change this if you really want. You can just see what it does. It kind of makes things brown, right? And the vignette is actually an artifact of photography. If you have really large aperture lenses, they tend to have more light in the center of the lens as compared to the outside of the lens. It's kind of an artistic effect, but it's also known as something that is also not necessarily desirable in a lens, depending on what you're trying to do, but it can add a little bit of sense of reality if you have just a touch of that. So maybe leave that at 20 or so, 30 if you really want it to be there. I don't really think it's that big of a deal, and I try to keep it off. Obviously here, so now we get into the zoom. Now this is probably the more important aspect of this. So just to give you an idea of what's going on here, if you take a look at the front of a lens, and you ever see like a fisheye lens, like an 8mm lens, which this is known as 1x. It doesn't actually tell you it's millimeters. I believe its default is 50mm. But just a practical example of this is we're looking at the back of the car here, and I'm going to use sort of the rule of thirds, which I'll explain here in a little bit more depth. I'll put the car pretty much on the bottom rule of third, and then the horizon here is on the top third, more or less. More of a recommendation. And that's the picture of the car right there. Looks delicious. Absolutely love it. Set the focus right back here. So this is default, pretty much 50mm, I believe. That's where it's at. But if we play with this and we kind of make it more fisheye and then zoom the camera back in to be that same sort of rule of thirds, depending on where it's at, you can see how this changes. And the car looks much more bulged out, but then narrows quite a bit as it gets farther away from you. So you can see just how more dramatic this is. This is kind of a cool shot. You see it used a lot in like skaters and stuff like that. It adds more of a dramatic effect in my opinion. So you may take this again and then also dab in a little bit more contrast and a bit more color to make it much more funky, right? More dramatic, depending on what you're trying to do. So maybe a 0.7 gives you that rear corner panel shot right there. and that is really dramatic and pops real nice right there. All right, so if we take the same sort of thing, but if we zoom it in, so as we're going, let's say, more here to 70 millimeters, 80 millimeters or so, still trying to put the car here on the bottom third. I'll reset my focus right there with the horizon on the top. You can see how this squares it up quite a bit more. Again, if you zoom in farther here, that's going to square up your car even more. And it's also, it looks like the background, which we can see right here, is not as far off as it may really be in real life. So while 1x may be what your eyes perceive naturally, zooming in is then going to kind of compress that field of view or compress that distance if you want to. So this will make things look a bit more square if you really want to. And depending on how you view your car, that may be desirable. I don't really find too high of zoom to be all that desirable, but it does work out depending on what your shot is. If you're looking for a really square sort of rear shot right here, and you might have instead of trees here, you have a very far off distance in the background. Like, I don't know, maybe it's hills, mountains, or you're on the top of a hill. So you can then kind of get your square image right there. So obviously your setting is going to kind of dictate whether or not you can use your different focal lengths or whatnot. That's more or less the overview of the different controls right here. And my gosh, look at that shot right there. I did one pretty similar like this on my Twitter. So if I just jump on over to that, you can see right there. Again, I had a little bit more distance in the background there. So, and I also used the back of the wing right here to frame up the top and to kind of drop away and just look so good. I then usually take this and I end up dropping them in GIMP right here. And then I crop to the left here and start working things like the curves and stuff right here. This is a free program, and you can kind of make it more dramatic, add a little bit of an S curve if you want to, and just play around with different things in post-process right there. So I'll just hit print screen on my computer and then drop it right in there and start post-processing that. One last thing I didn't cover right here is the vignette style. So depending on what you're doing right here, you can hit the right bumper and you can change up how that kind of that blur on the edges of the screen affects your photograph. So in this case, a blur on the top and bottom might actually be ideal, but I don't want it to be too much, so maybe right around 70 right there. Just to add a little bit extra, a little something special, just another little bit of a layer. A lot of little things add up to make a really great photo. So now that we know the tools, we can really play around with the scenes as much as you want. Again, you can tilt them, and then maybe you can say, okay, maybe the quarter panel view of the car is just overdone. What I want is just a really nice scene in the background. Maybe there's just a nice skybox right here with a cool car that might be in the picture right there. So you can kind of do something like this. And again, fish eyes work really good for those landscape photographs and stuff like that. At the end of the day, I like to say photography is seeing what everybody else is seeing, but from a different perspective. And in this scene right here, there's got to be at least 50 different photographs that would look absolutely awesome. At any rate, though, that is kind of my introduction or sort of my overview of taking good photographs here inside of Forza Horizon 3. Hopefully you found this somewhat informative or maybe helpful or interesting, and maybe it sparks you to get into a DSLR and take up photography as a hobby. I don't know. We'll just see where it goes from there. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys next time. Stay awesome. Peace. Brothgar out. And if I've earned your subscription, then thank you so much for that. Okay, here we go. Come on! Yeah! Woo! Woo! I totally got him! Come on, baby, go, 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 go. Do it, do it, do it. Oh, yeah, get some of that. Get some of that. That was building a roller coaster on a floating island right there. Pretty cool idea. Fun stuff. I enjoyed it. 1 million. There we go. Now we're talking. That's the sound of money if I ever heard it. Woo! It's kind of got a weird ring to it. I'm liking it so far. Bye-bye!